Steak is a great source of protein, iron, and more. However, its nutritional benefits can be outweighed by its unhealthy elements. Armed with nutrition facts, you'll find it easier to make steak choices that support your overall well-being. Many steak lovers simply can't resist the juicy tenderness of a ribeye. Unfortunately, it's one of the least healthy steak cuts out there. This makes sense given that it's the fattiest muscle in the whole cow. Because the fats are so evenly dispersed throughout the meat, it's impossible to cut it out. Not that anyone who's eating a ribeye would want to.
Steak? Did you say steak?
Looking into the nutrition information, the concentrations of fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol are notably high. In a 3-ounce serving, you're looking at 16 grams of fat, 7 of which are saturated fat, and 66 milligrams of cholesterol. To put this in perspective, based on a recommended 2,000-calorie daily diet, that's 21% of your daily fat, 36% of your saturated fat, and 22% of your cholesterol intake. This might not seem too bad, but it would be irresponsible not to consider the typical ribeye portion sizes. It's common for a person to eat anywhere from 6 to 16 ounces in a single meal. So if you eat a 10-ounce portion of ribeye, you're consuming 68% of the daily recommended fat intake, 120% of the daily recommended saturated fat intake, and 73% of the daily recommended cholesterol intake. And this is without adding butter, sauce, or sides. Again, we're not saying you should never eat a big, juicy ribeye, but for the sake of your health, it's best to do so sparingly. Prime rib and ribeye have lots in common. While both come from the rib section of the cow, the way a butcher cuts and prepares prime rib versus ribeye marks the difference between them. Ribeyes are cut into individual steaks. Prime rib is the larger roast cut, usually cooked with the bone still attached. And just like the ribeye, prime rib is on the far unhealthy end of the steak scale.
Is it safe to eat that much food, Dr. Hibbert?
I wouldn't have thought so before I bought 12% of this restaurant.
Specifically, let's look at prime rib's saturated fat and cholesterol content. A 3-ounce portion of prime rib has about 9 grams of saturated fat, 71 milligrams of cholesterol. This is remarkably high at 47% and 24% of the FDA's daily recommended consumption of saturated fat and cholesterol, respectively. And again, people don't usually limit themselves to 3 ounces. A chef slices off a serving of 12 or even 16 ounces. All you have to do is multiply the nutrition values by 4 or more to realize that eating such a large portion of prime rib can be unhealthy. The Porterhouse is a bone-in steak that encompasses 2 main cuts. On the long side of the bone is a strip steak, and on the short side is the tenderloin. This means you get the rich, robust taste of the strip steak, and on the other side of the bone, the perfect complement with the tenderloin's buttery texture. Often viewed as the ultimate luxury in the world of steaks, the Porterhouse is almost always served in a portion of around 16 ounces. This is great news for your taste buds, but not the best for your health.
Whew. Here come the meat sweats.
A 16-ounce Porterhouse has nearly 1,000 calories, 65% of the FDA's daily recommended fat intake, 90% of the daily recommended saturated fat, and 94% of the daily recommended cholesterol. In other words, Porterhouse steaks are a heart health nightmare. Understandably, a true steak lover won't be able to resist eating one every so often. All nutrition matters aside, still, you might consider splitting it with someone in the interest of harm reduction. The T-bone steak gets its name from its appearance. If you look at the structure of this well-known cut, you'll see a bone in the shape of a T right down the middle, dividing the tenderloin on the short side from the strip steak on the long side. The T-bone is a close cousin to the Porterhouse, which also has that eye-catching bone down its center. The difference between the two is only size, regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, according to its institutional meat purchase specifications. The tenderloin of a Porterhouse has to be at least 1.25 inches thick. For a T-bone, it only has to be 0.5 inches thick.
I've been working here for 44 years. Ain't nobody ever ordered nothing but T-bone steak and a baked potato.
Logically, then, it makes sense that the T-bone is only slightly healthier than the shockingly unhealthy Porterhouse, because you typically eat less of it. A standard serving of T-bone steak is around 8 to 12 ounces. Even if you were to choose an 8-ounce portion, the nutrition facts are still abysmal. With 58% of what the FDA recommends daily for fat, 95% of its daily recommendation for saturated fat, and 63% of its daily recommendation for cholesterol. This isn't a steak cut you should be eating all that often. The New York strip is usually a bone-in cut of beef with a significant fat cap running along one side of the bone. This fat helps give the New York strip such a delicious flavor. The cut comes from the shorter loin section of the cow with lots of marbling throughout. Another reason it's such a tender and tasty cut. However, all that fat isn't good for you, especially considering the cut is ideally 2 inches thick, making its typical serving size around 10 to 12 ounces.
Steak night!
A 10-ounce New York strip has a whopping 25 grams of saturated fat per serving, or 127% of what the FDA says you should be eating daily on a 2,000-calorie diet. Alongside the hefty dose of saturated fat, it also has 81% of the overall fat the FDA recommends per day and 74% of the cholesterol. For a slightly less fatty version of the New York strip, you can try to find an option without the bone. Though because of all the marbling in the meat, the difference isn't all that significant. Whether or not you're particularly health conscious, this isn't a cut of meat meant to be eaten daily or even monthly. The chuck-eye steak, which also goes by a fancier name, the Delmonico, comes from the shoulder region of the cow, not all that far from the ribeye. The chuck-eye is different from the more general chuck cut, as it comes from the cow's fifth rib rather than further up the neck. This makes it more tender than other chuck cuts, but slightly less tender than the ribeye. Many people refer to it as the poor man's ribeye for being fairly similar in taste and texture, but costing notably less per ounce. And like the ribeye, it's also not very healthy, with lots of fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. It's easier to find chuck-eye cuts in smaller portions than many of the other steaks on this list, something that helps it a bit in the health department. In a 6-ounce serving, which is common in grocery stores and restaurants, a piece of chuck-eye contains 44% of what the FDA recommends eating daily for overall fat, 74% saturated fat, and 49% cholesterol. The fat and cholesterol content, while still high, are somewhat reasonable for a single meal, especially compared to the other high-fat cuts on this list. The Picanha cut isn't well known yet in the US and Europe, though it's gaining momentum. But other parts of the world have known about this cut for ages. It has been one of the most popular steak cuts throughout Latin America for quite some time. In Brazil, picanha is considered one of the highest-end steak cuts you can get, and the country is often credited for its rise to fame. The picanha cut comes from the rump or sirloin cap. The area has little muscle and lots of fat, making it tender and juicy, but also not exactly the epitome of health. For steak on the unhealthier side, picanha doesn't have the worst health profile, though it's still up there. A typical 5-ounce piece of picanha has around 43% of the daily recommended saturated fat intake and 45% of the daily recommended cholesterol intake. Considering that this cut isn't easy to find in US grocery stores, it's probably better left for eating when you visit a fancy Brazilian steakhouse. Flat iron steak comes from a muscular chuck part of the cow's shoulder. All this muscle makes it a marbled and tender cut that's highly flavorful, but not the healthiest. When laid out, its shape is reminiscent of an old-style metal flat iron, hence the name. It's not quite as high in fat and saturated fat as some of the others on the list, but it's still far from a lean cut of beef. A 6-ounce cut of flat iron steak has over 22 grams of fat and about 9 grams of saturated fat, which is respectively 28% and 43% of the daily recommended value. The cholesterol levels in the flat iron cut are high as well, at 142 grams, or 47% of what you're supposed to consume daily. Luckily, because flat iron is commonly served in dishes like tacos or fajitas, it's pretty easy to eat much less than a 6-ounce portion to keep the negative health impact to a minimum. Flap steak comes from the cow's mid-rear section, a region known for its muscle density. It's popular in tacos and stir-fry because, if not cooked just right, it can easily become tough and chewy. However, when it's cooked either rare over high heat or very slowly, the muscles become more tender. This allows it to be enjoyed as a traditional steak, especially when sliced thin. While undercooking flap steak can enhance its tenderness, it also increases the risk of foodborne illness such as E. coli and salmonella.
Food poisoning. Gross!
Flap steak is also high in fat and saturated fat compared to many leaner cuts, like eye of round or top round. For example, it has 49% of the daily recommended saturated fat in a 6-ounce serving, whereas Eye of Round only has 14% in the same serving size. Interestingly, flap steak's cholesterol level is slightly lower than many other unhealthy steak cuts, with only 39% of the daily recommended value in a 6-ounce serving. This isn't low by any means, but it's low for a higher fat steak. The notoriously yummy filet mignon is cut from the smaller side of the tenderloin. It is widely known for being a thick, tender, juicy piece of meat, not to mention among the most expensive on the market. Most steak aficionados will agree it's worth it for such ideal flavor and texture. A common misconception is that filet mignon is a lean cut, but the truth is another story. Sure, compared to ribeye or New York strip steak, filet mignon isn't nearly as unhealthy, but it's still fairly high in fat, especially in saturated fat and cholesterol. Fortunately, people tend to eat it in smaller portions of around 6 to 8 ounces, reducing its negative health impact per sitting.
I got filet mignon.
A 6-ounce piece of filet mignon has 38% of the recommended daily fat intake, 57% of the daily recommended saturated fat intake, and 55% of the daily recommended cholesterol intake. These aren't great percentages for anyone who's conscious of how the food they eat affects their health. On top of that, despite being a bit lower in fat and cholesterol than some of the unhealthiest cuts, filet mignon's caloric value remains high, at around 454 calories for every 6-ounce serving. As tasty as this steak is, saving it for special occasions seems like the right choice where your health is concerned. With a name like Oxtail, you may be wondering if it's actually a beef cut, but the name is misleading. Historically, oxtail did come from the tail of an ox, but these days, oxtail usually refers to the meat from the cow's tail. It's never been considered a prime cut and was cooked by communities who utilize every part of the animal. Its texture is somewhat gelatinous thanks to its high collagen content, which people tend to either love or hate.
Oxtail soup sure do taste sweet.
In terms of health, oxtail doesn't fare better than the other steak cuts on this list, with high concentrations of fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. When you eat oxtail, the serving is a single tail that tends to weigh somewhere between 7 and 10 ounces. At that size, you're looking at 65% of the daily recommended saturated fat consumption and 74% of the daily recommended cholesterol consumption in one sitting. Oxtail may be a delightful addition to gourmet dishes, but for health reasons, we wouldn't suggest making it a staple.